The Enlightenment brought logic and reason to colonists' consideration of the natural world. However, religion remained a critical aspect of daily life, even though at the beginning of the 18th century many colonists lived outside the reach of organized churches. Isolated from their seaboard peers, the pioneers were often too far away to attend church and religious gatherings. Churches still used traditional means of gaining new members, including building new churches and teaching children the articles and liturgies. But ministers were inching toward the discovery of a new mechanism, the revival, that would recruit not just an individual or a family, but hundreds of people at once. The stage was set for a series of religious revivals, which would collectively become known as the Great Awakening. As American thinking grew more scientific and settlers grew more prosperous, the colonists began to desire a more relaxed way of life. As a result, the dependency on strict religious tenets eased. Harsh Calvinist beliefs fell by the wayside as preachers such as Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield took over the pulpits. Jonathan Edwards became his generation's greatest theorist of revivalism. His most famous speech, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," preached at Enfield, Connecticut in 1741, is arguably the most famous American sermon of all time.
The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. Jonathan Edwards, 1741.
Edwards perfected the traditional New England revival in which a pastor awakens a spiritual outpouring in his own congregation. George Whitefield's technique of field preaching, however, became the American standard. Whitefield gathered hundreds, even thousands of people into a public space and subjected them to highly emotional, dramatic sermons.
Good God, how amazing is the consideration that those whom God has called out to labor in spiritual things should be so backward in this duty as fatal experience teacheth. Our clergy, that is the generality thereof, are only seeking after preferment, running up and down to obtain one benefice after another, and to heap up an estate, either to spend on the pleasures of life or to gratify their sensual appetites, while the poor of their flock are forgotten, nay, worse, they are scorned, hated, and disdained. George Whitefield, 1746.
With Whitefield's charisma and theatrical flair, dozens of people at a time were excited to experience conversion. Even skeptical, logic-driven Benjamin Franklin was so moved by Whitefield's oration that he was compelled to empty his pockets at a Whitefield revival. Whitefield's practice fit better with conditions south of New England, where religious pluralism was greater. The ecclesiastical organizations were often weaker, and a greater percentage of the population were not members of a church. Reaching all 13 colonies between 1739 and 1741, and returning to many of them a few years later, Whitefield captivated audiences, who followed his movements through newspaper articles and journals that he wittingly published in order to advertise his journeys and accomplishments. In the short run, the Great Awakening accelerated church membership, dropping the age at conversion and temporarily increasing the percentage of converts who were male. In the long run, it had the effect of recruiting people who would likely have joined churches anyway, though more gradually. It also represented the first concerted effort to convert African Americans and Native peoples living within the boundaries of colonial settlement. The awakening spurred enormous controversy. Many ministers, because of the Enlightenment, began to distrust spiritual claims based solely on personal revelation. They doubted the authenticity of some conversions, shuddered at traveling preachers luring people out of their own congregations, and disliked the self-righteousness displayed by converts who claimed to be able to determine whether their ministers and other church members enjoyed grace or not. As a result, many Congregationalists and Presbyterians split off from their churches and joined the Baptists, Methodists, and other moderate sects. Some traditionalists rejected the teachings of Whitefield, Edwards, and other preachers of the Great Awakening as too radical, which divided their church into two groups. The traditionalists became known as Old Lights in the Congregational churches and Old Sides in the Presbyterian churches. Their counterparts who were accepting of the new doctrines became known as New Lights and New Sides. Both parties agreed on the need for living a life that glorified God, but the New Lights and New Sides took the view that salvation was man's responsibility rather than God's. The Awakening and the Enlightenment interacted in complex ways. The Enlightenment had its greatest impact among colonial elites, who in years to come would write a national constitution that balanced power among agencies of the government, protected religious liberty, and prevented the establishment of a national church. Most colonists, however, continued to subscribe to Protestant views of grace and salvation. Both the Enlightenment and the Awakening fostered religious liberty, but in different ways. The Enlightenment underscored an individual's natural rights to choose one's faith. The Awakening contributed by heralding the rights of dissenters to worship as they pleased, without state interference. During the Great Awakening, a coalition of enlightened liberals and evangelicals would write religious liberty into the law of the land.